English Literature Studies. Hey there, welcome to English Literature Studies. In this video, we are going to study kinds of poetry. So let's get started with the kinds of poetry. We have two kinds of poetry, subjective poetry and objective poetry. What is the difference between these two kinds of poetry, and why is there a need to divide poetry? Well, it all depends on the handling of the subject matter by the poet. It determines the kind of the poetry, the way he uses the subject matter. If he is writing all about his experiences, his personal thoughts, his personal experiences, that is subjective poetry. However, if he is not including himself in the subject matter of the poetry, then that is an objective poetry. So it all depends on the handling of the matter, the subject matter of the poetry by the poet, and that determines the kind of the poetry. So let's see these both kinds of poetry in detail. Subjective poetry. It is concerned with conveying the personal experiences of the writer. When the writer is writing about himself, his own thoughts, experiences, his likes, dislikes, when he writes about his feeling, then that is called subjective poetry. This is majorly concerned with the writer only. Like autobiography has nothing to do with anybody else but the writer himself. So this is subjective poetry. There are many other examples of subjective poetry. Objective poetry. Now, objective poetry is the opposite of subjective poetry. It is an impersonal writing. It is concerned with the impersonal experiences when the writer detaches himself out of the work. He exudes his feelings, his own ideas, his own thoughts. Rather, he describes the surrounding. He describes other people, other things that has nothing to do with the writer, but with the environment, the people around him, for general people, for the reality that the people are carrying with them, like dramatic poetry, narrative poetry, also biography, which has nothing to do with the writer but the person he is writing about only. Objective poetry is completely opposite to subjective poetry. It is quite difficult to separate writings on these two kinds of poetry, like objective poetry and subjective poetry, because there are many writings, there are many poetries. It's really hard to guess. It becomes really hard to analyze either it is a subjective poetry or objective poetry, just because of the mingling of these two kinds of the poetry in a single poetry. So this is all about the kinds of the poetry. We are going to study these both in detail in separate video. Thank you for watching.